Welcome to Film Studies Minor. On today's episode, we are doing a scene breakdown. And this is going to be kind of a chance to maybe highlight something that we talked about in the film episode. So for today's episode, we're going to be talking about this idea of crossing the fantastical gap in music and film. It's this idea of going from diegetic music to non-diegetic music, or the reverse of that. And what we're going to try to do is do a little comparison. So the scene that we found is Rise of the Valkyries from Apocalypse Now. And it's this is the fantastical gap kind of example, and then we're going to compare that to Stuck in the Middle of You, that scene from Reservoir Dogs, and which is much more of just keeping the music completely diegetic. So with me, as always, is Colby Graham.
Hi, everyone.
And Jackson Miller.
Hello.
So, guys, what did you think about the Rise of the Valkyries scene and this idea of crossing the fantastical gap? What were your first impressions of the music? So when they start it, they obviously start playing it in the helicopters on the speakers.
Shall we dance?
And as the scene progresses, it kind of transforms. We leave the helicopter, we leave all the men, and now we're kind of above the whole aerial attack. And we still hear the music, but now it sounds much more full. It doesn't sound like it's coming out of the speakers. It actually sounds like soundtrack would. So what was your first impression, Colby? Did you think that was powerful or not? And if so, why not?
Yeah, I think it's very powerful because I think you start with, it's very kind of quiet. You just hear the helicopter sounds, and then they start playing the music. And even one of the characters references that he likes playing the music because it scares the hell out of the people. And then they start playing it from the helicopters, and you are essentially feel like you're kind of in that helicopter where you feel like you're hearing the music and you're bombing the hell out of this place. So I think it's very powerful.
And then we kind of leave that helicopter, and all of a sudden now we feel more powerful because now we're kind of above the whole attack. Like we see this whole attack happening. And then Jackson, what did that do for you? Did you think when it does cross that gap, do you think that it becomes more powerful? Like the audience becomes more powerful in a way?
I think what you were reading something from the guy who scored the movie.
Right.
He said his reason or example for doing it was to kind of contrast like the theoretical glory of war moment with kind of like the horrors and brutality of like what's actually going to happen and kind of the rest of the movie, which I understand that's kind of like what Apocalypse Now is like really examining. And it's an interesting little, since they kind of take us on a little ride, it's an interesting, we've seen these soldiers, we know them, and so we kind of understand like more of like how awful all of this really is. And then we see them kind of put on the, I don't know, facade, but kind of trying to hype themselves up and like, okay, we're just, let's play this music, let's get it going. And then it cuts, or it doesn't cut, but it transitions to, from us thinking more about like the characters as actual people and kind of how horrible everything can be to, oh yeah, but now like we're watching these cool warships going to war and awesome like swelling music. And it kind of, I think just if, with that being his intention, it does a great job of kind of removing you for a minute of this just being, any other kind of charge of, it's what Ride of the Valkyries, like any other thing in a movie where thinking like the Two Towers or something from Lord of the Rings where you're seeing, oh, here's all the horses and everybody's, here that is the heroic reinforcements coming to save the day. But again, the purpose is kind of to almost trick you into thinking that for a minute.
Right.
And let yourself get caught up in the like, yay, let's go.
It also gives you a sense of, like Mark Mangini he did the sound for Mad Max, tied back to that. He called it onboarding, where in Mad Max, you start with all the car sounds. So everything was shot to where you sound like you're in the car, but they never like cut to the engines like Fast and the Furious would. But so same thing with this, but you're hearing the music. Mm-hmm. So you're hearing, so you kind of maybe still feel like you are still in that one helicopter and the music's blasting.
Right.
But yet it is played across all of those scenes.
And if you compare this scene with the Reservoir Dogs scene, what's interesting with that one is that music plays diegetically on the radio. He starts torturing him, and then he leaves the building, right? And he goes out to the car. And the moment that he leaves the building, the music, you feel it fade away, right? And when he gets to the car, and it's just like the diegetic sound of the world at that point, and you just hear people like nearby and children or whatever.
Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right, here I am. 'em. 'Cause 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 'em
and then he walks back in and the music fades back up, and now we're like back in this like terrifying environment. What do you think about that scene in comparison to Rise of the Valkyries?
I thought it was interesting because that was this was the example that almost immediately came to mind when you were kind of discussing diegetic sound, as that almost being. I don't want to say if this was the first. I'm sure there were others, but this was kind of probably an early, pretty like it's so unusual that kind of its sound is handled this way that really makes it stick out.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, it's just the similar, I guess, to how the scene from Apocalypse Now is intended to kind of contrast the glory of war versus horrors of war. This does a very good job of, in several levels, of having Mr. Blonde, I believe, is the character.
Mm-hmm.
He's just this absolute, heartless monster who's
Right.
in the scene. They've captured one of the police officers who kind of broke up the raid or was tipped off about the raid,
Mm-hmm.
and so he's just starting to cut him up and torturing him. And the entire time he's dancing and kind of grooving to like this upbeat, happy song.
Right.
So it's pretty obvious, like, oh, look at this twisted guy. This is what he's really into. And then again, not just that, but then they carry it over to as he's leaving the warehouse that we spend most of the movie in,
Right.
except for all the flashbacks. And it as you said, as he leaves, it fades off to where it's then replaced with just kind of the sound of probably not like the nicest neighborhood in the world, but just like a
Right.
standard
Right.
any street. If anybody were to drive by or walk by, they just see some guy messing with a trunk, basically.
Right.
Then he walks back to the kind of horror scene that's happening inside.
It also it reminded me also in Mad Max the same way we talked about Guitarist Dude and how he helps define where people are in relation to each other and location and things like that. This really also sets location, right? Like, and in an actually pretty scary way. Like he's inside this room and it's like terrifying and he's cutting dude up, and then he walks out, and when he walks out, the music fades away. He goes to the car. And then when he turns around, the camera turns around, and we're looking back at the building now. So we know, like, we're going back into this environment. And actually what it then does, because the first time the song comes on, it's just weird, right? Like on the radio. But now when we come back in and he opens the door and we start to hear the song again, now it has like a different connotation for us. Now we're like, oh,
Now
great.
it's like-
Now we're like, what's he going to do next,
Now it's like the Jaws theme or something. It's
Right.
transformed from like, oh, this is like a weird choice to like,
Right.
oh gosh, we're back into.
And it's amazing how it does it because it never cuts, right? It just follows him out and then he comes back in. So it's just crazy how just in that time span of it going away and then coming back, it's like, oh, now it's like terrifying,
It'd be interesting to see the same scene where it's not cut.
Right.
It's a very different feel, I feel like, if
Right.
it didn't cut from or fade out.
Right.
It'd be interesting to see that.
And that would have been Crossing the Fantastical Gap if he had left the building and then the music had taken on a fuller sound and left that radio sound behind. Then now it is like a totally different emotion to it because now the song is just kind of playing, in a way. And whereas when it stays diegetic, it kind of switches, and it becomes like this like scary thing all of a sudden that we're kind of afraid of, Well, this has been a scene breakdown. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, how do they get to hear more about us?
Well, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Film Studies Minor and on Twitter at FS Minor.